spears or swords or anything like that, but this moved up a little bit. So the Israelites are now armed, and the Philistines are great at fighting on the plain of Philistia. Now, on the whole western side of Israel is the plain which goes up to the Mediterranean Sea, and you can run a chariot through the plains pretty easily. But when you get to the mountains, you can't really use a chariot. And so the battle went like this. The chariots came up. They chased Saul and some of the army and Jonathan. They chased them into the mountains where the chariots were not useful. And it says in the last chapter of 1 Samuel that it was the archers that actually shot Saul because they couldn't get the chariots up there. And so the archers shot Saul, and he was dying according to that narrative. And he said to his bodyguard, his shield bearer, kill me. And the shield bearer refused to, and so he killed himself. And then when the bodyguard saw that he'd kill himself, he also killed himself. Now this guy comes with a different story. And this bothers some people. They say, well, there's a contradiction in the story between chapter 31 of 1 Samuel and chapter 1 of 2 Samuel. And that's a ridiculous thought, really, because it's what we come to is somebody telling an untruth in 2 Samuel chapter 1. You know, the Bible is filled with lies. Well, this is one. The guy, he shows up and he's lying. It's like the devil said to Jesus, throw yourself down and the angels will lift you up. Well, that was a lie. It's recorded in the Bible, but it was a lie. And there's a lot of stories in, especially the Old Testament, where people lie to each other. Have you ever lied to anybody? Let me see your hands. We all at one point or another have done that, right? Yeah, just a little white lie. Well, this guy might have thought what he was reporting was a little white lie, but it turned out to be a serious lie. David said, "Where have you come from?" And he said, "I've escaped from the camp of Israel." Now you can go to that place and you can see where this death of Saul was, and it's hilly and it's rocky and there's huge boulders, and there's no way that any chariot could get up there. So I'm making a point of that so that you can see when we hear what the Amalekite says, he's obviously lying, but he's telling partly the truth. Verse number 4. How did things go? You know, they didn't have Facebook and Twitter and texting. It's 3 days later, and the first runner has come from the north to the south. Why was the Amalekite going to the south? Simple. That's where he came from. He's heading back to the land of the Amalekites. There's a huge battle. He's got to get out of Dodge, kind of like the Ukrainians trying to get into Poland. Now, one of my friends, Julia, who was in the Bible school in Zaporozhye, she escaped to Poland. And one of the guys that was in the Bible school in Seattle, he just escaped to Poland with his little girl and his wife. When there's a war going on, you've got to get out of Dodge. And so he's thinking it's going to be a safe place to go to the land of the Amalekites, but David has just fought a couple of days with the Amalekites, and all the Amalekites that are on camels, 200 or 300, what was it? Something like that. They've escaped. David's gone, and he's decimated those that couldn't get away on camels, and he brought all of the spoils back, and all the money comes back to Ziklag, and he takes the other money. You know, this is in the future, a few days or a week or whatever, a month, and he takes it and he gives it back to the different places in Judah. because the Amalekites have raided them as well. And so he says the army has fled. Many of the army fell and died, and Saul and Jonathan also died. Well, we see here that the Amalekite didn't have all the information, because it tells us in chapter 31 of 1 Samuel that another son has also been killed, another son of Saul. And so he says, I've come from this place. Now, why was he even there? Look at verse 5. How do you know that Saul and Jonathan died? I happened to be on Mount Gilboa. Just happened to be there. And there was Saul leaning on his spear while the chariots and the horsemen drew close to him. Obviously a lie. The chariots can't get up there. No way. So he starts to tell his tale. When he looked behind him, he saw me, and he called me. And I answered, Here, sir. Please move ahead. There we go. And he said to me, Who are you? And I answered, I'm an Amalekite. And he said, Come stand over me and kill me, for convulsions have seized me, yet my life still lingers. So I stood over him and killed him, for I knew that he could not live after he had fallen. But the previous chapter says he killed himself. Now, if this is a contradictory story, why on earth would somebody who is putting these things together, why would an editor put conflicting stories one chapter to the next? Doesn't make sense at all. It's ridiculous, actually. The editor is merely reporting what this guy said. And he's lying. He's not telling the truth. We know for sure, the end of that verse says, I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I've brought them here to my Lord. So he brings David the crown and the armlet, which was like a signet. You know what a signet is? It's in ancient days, if you wrote a letter, you would roll up the scroll, you'd take some hot wax and you put a seal on it, and then you would take your signet and you would push the signet in, and you dare not open that letter. On the pains of death, just about. You don't open the mail. You don't open somebody else's mail. It's a federal offense to open somebody's mail. And so Saul had this signet on his arm where he could send letters to people, and they would know for sure it came from Saul because it had the signet ring. That's where we get the word signature. Boom. So we know for sure, absolutely for sure, that this Amalekite is the first one on scene. Because he's got the crown. So he was definitely there. Somebody else didn't find that crown and just give it to the Amalekite. No way. If you found a gold bracelet and a gold crown in the midst of a war, what would you do with it? You take it down to Smitty and have it melted down. You wouldn't go and present it to an enemy king unless you wanted to see the enemy king become king. You know, I like being involved in politics, and I hate it. Seriously. When I go to the Conservative Party and the Republicans come and they want the endorsement of the Conservatives, I mean, a week ago, Ron Singletary was in the basement of the church here because the Conservatives didn't have a place that was on President's Day, and they didn't have a place where they could meet, so we met here. And you know who Ron Singletary is, right? He's the guy that refused to acquiesce to Lovely Warren, and he was fired as the police chief of Rochester. Tremendous human being. Honest person. At the cost of his job, he refused to do the wrong thing. And he's running for Congress. Not in your district, though. They've cut us all up. But in our district, yes. And I love to be able to shake hands with the people and to meet those that are running for office. I now know all of the Canandaigua town board members. I know the judges. Have known the sheriff, and it's really good to know who's in charge. And I can imagine that this Amalekite is thinking, "Hey, I've been living here a long time, and I've got this crown, and I can deliver it to David." But what he doesn't do, what he isn't doing, is being honest, because he embellishes the story. It would have been a good story if he said, "Hey, I was running away from the battle and I ran across the king and I found his crown and his armlet and I'm bringing them to you." That wouldn't have been too bad of a thing, because it probably would have ingratiated him to David. But the irony of the whole thing is, Saul is rejected by God for not doing what he was told to do with the Amalekites. And now an Amalekite is bringing him the crown jewels. The transition of kingdom. Samuel said, "The Lord has taken the kingdom away from you and given it to your neighbor who's better than you are." And then Saul starts persecuting David. Now, the whole rest of the story is the persecution of Saul, because Saul knows that David is going to be the next king. And the reason he's going to be the next king is because Saul didn't do what he was supposed to do with the Amalekites. Now the Amalekite finds this guy dead, and he brings David the crown. Isn't that odd? I stood over him and killed him, for I knew he could not live after he had fallen. We have a term for this today. It's called assisted suicide. Isn't it? Maybe not with drugs, not sticking a needle in the arm and putting them to sleep like a dog. What do you think of assisted suicide? They're doing it. You're aware of that, right? They're doing it. They're doing it quietly by giving people drug overdoses. Am I right? You don't dare say. I understand your reluctance to answer that question. It's been a huge topic since Kevorkian. How many years ago has that been? 35, 40 years ago. The suicide machine. But we know that it's a lie in this case, but it brings up the topic. As somebody said a week or so ago, when they asked the question, when is life over? And the person answered, when the heart stops beating. And the other person said, well, what if they resuscitate the person? Is the stopping of the heart actually death? And then they said, when does life begin? And some people will say when the heart starts beating. But the same answer has to be on both sides. I mean, some, including Roman Catholics, would even say capital punishment is out because, if abortion is out, capital punishment must be out as well. The Bible doesn't say that, though. The Bible says a life for a life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But in the event of trial and 2 or 3 witnesses, so nobody could be put to death unless they had proof. Of course, we have all kinds of proof today, forensic proof and eyewitness proof and circumstantial evidence and all of these things, which they didn't have in those days. It would be very hard to convict somebody in biblical times for a death penalty, if nobody saw it. So he says in verse 10, I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm. Is that stealing? I remember when I was a little boy. Oh man, where'd the time go? That's all right. You'll be home in time for lunch. Whatever time you eat today. When I was a little boy, I can remember there was a car accident on Clover Street in Honolulu Falls, and the woman was killed. And she had apparently, I remember my grandfather telling me this, she apparently had a large diamond ring. And when the first responders and everybody got there, nothing. Gone. Somebody came by. Oh, she's dead. She doesn't need that anymore. My grandfather also told me another story of a guy who was killed in a car wreck. And he knew who did this. There was a shotgun in the back seat of the car, and the guy's in the car dead. And somebody came along, pulled the shotgun out of the car, and slipped it in a sluice, where the water goes, and waited for everybody to leave and came back and got the shotgun. Is that stealing? So that's what this guy did. Now, on the other hand, if he didn't get it, if he didn't take them, someone else would have. But it's really amazing that this fellow took them and immediately brought them to David, who is about to be king. I brought them here to my Lord, it says in verse 10. Please move. There we go. David took hold of his clothes and tore them. And the men who were with him did the same. And they mourned and they wept and they fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan and for the army of the Lord and the house of Israel, because they'd fallen by the sword. He is in exile. He's in Philistia. He's fighting Amalekites. And his country is devastated by the Philistines in his absence, and the king is dead, and the king's son is dead, and many of the people in the army are dead, and the people have lost their possessions and their villages. And can you see how that might have really upset David? First of all, Jonathan is dead, who's his best friend. Secondly, his nation is under the rule of these kind of bad people. And so he's really upset about this. So what does he do? He says, "Where do you come from?" He answered, "I am the son of a resident alien." They had Amalekites that were their enemies that were living in Amalekite land. And there was an Amalekite living in Israel with a green card. Resident alien. It's a biblical term. The resident aliens had the same rights as any Israelite. If you look back at the law of Moses, if somebody came and lived among them and they had to accept them as a resident alien and they had to be treated the same, but they also had to obey all the laws of the land. You know, the whole idea of somebody moving here and setting up a Sharia court, you know, is not biblical. And so this guy is a second generation resident alien. And he had to be treated the same as an Israelite. And his responsibilities were the same as an Israelite. And as an Israelite, it's against the law to kill the king, even if it's assisted suicide. And so, it didn't work out too well. Why are you not afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? Now this word, anointed, we need to talk about this for a minute. And I'm sorry if I'm keeping you late, but you know, this is important stuff. Anointed in Hebrew is Mashiach. In English, Messiah. In Greek, Christ. Why were you not afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's Christ? Psalm 2. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, against his Christ, against his Messiah. They say, let us burst bonds asunder and cast their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs, and the Lord has them in derision. He will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, I've set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Psalm 2. The idea of Messiah, the idea of Christ, is throughout the Old Testament. And because Saul was anointed by Samuel, he was, in a sense, a type of Christ. And so as a type of Christ, which is the reason why David refused to kill him. And here's a guy, a resident alien, who by his own testimony, that he killed him, even though he didn't really kill him. He thought that he could garner favor from David by saying that he killed him, but in fact he did not kill him. He simply stripped his corpse of the royal vestige. David said to him, he called one of his young men and said, come here, strike him down. So he struck him down and he died. He didn't strike him down with a sword, he struck him down with rocks. Because that's how you execute a murderer in Judaism. You've said it yourself. The two witnesses, the crown and the armlet, plus the voice, his own voice, condemned him to death. Because in the land of Israel, murder is punishable by death. Now, it wasn't done correctly because he should have had a trial. But those are dangerous times. And he found himself dead. And David kills the Amalekite that plundered Saul's crown and delivered it to him. It seemed like a little lie. It seemed like it would be very beneficial for this guy. Oh, you know, I'm going to have a place in the court, and I'm going to have special treatment, and I'm going to get paid from the government, and I'll be given a good job, and everything will be good for me and my family, and maybe I can keep David from warring with the rest of the Amalekites, and everything's going to be good. And everything was not good. Just like those who killed Jesus Christ. You know, you can ask Pilate, why were you not afraid to kill the Lord's anointed? Oh, I've just washed my hands of the whole thing, no big deal. It's your fault. sends him to the cross. So that's all I have. What do you have to say about this? Your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you. I've killed the Lord's anointed. David didn't go for the mercy-killing argument. Has anything changed? Wars and rumors of wars and plunderers. We live in a blessed place where this isn't happening to us. I mean, you can say, in the War of 1812, we had people here die, and people have died in Europe in the First and Second World War and in Vietnam and stuff like that. But since 1812, there's been no war on our soil right here. Our whole lives have been without it. Pardon me? I didn't hear what you said. I was referring to here. Anyone? Did David do the right thing? You almost have to say no, don't you? He didn't give him his day in court. But, there weren't too many judges. I mean, Samuel was basically the last judge. And the judgment was given to kings from this day forward in the future, where the king would decide the major matters. But he wasn't king yet. He was elected by God to be king, but not elected by the people to be king. Anyone? Now, something happens here at this juncture that you need to understand, so listen carefully. Saul's son, Ishbosheth, becomes king in the north. And David is about to become the king of Judah. Now, there were 12 tribes. And in the area of Judah, it's in the southern part of Israel. It's always called Judah, but it's actually Judah and Simeon. And that became one country. And then in the north, the other 10 tribes became known as Israel. So from this time forward, there's a distinction between Israel and Judah. And as we read through, you'll see, especially if you read through First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles, you see kings of Judah and kings of Israel. And they're not the same people, they're different countries. And so here, David is about to be anointed as king in Judah, and Ishbosheth is about to be anointed king in Israel. Different countries now. Like different states, but not united. And so, hopefully next week I'll show you on a map. I was going to show you today, but that didn't happen. All right. Did he do the right thing? God bless you.